Step into a world where the air is thick with secrets, where the faintest clue can unravel the darkest of crimes, and where only the sharpest minds prevail. Welcome to Classic Detective Tales, a place devoted to the timeless art of mystery and deduction. Here, you'll wander through fog-covered London streets alongside Sherlock Holmes, tracing footprints invisible to the ordinary eye. You'll sit quietly in the drawing rooms of English country estates with Hercule Poirot, watching as he pieces together fragments of truth hidden behind polite smiles and well-guarded lies. You'll find yourself in the smoky offices and rain alleys of noirier cities, where hard-boiled detectives like Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe chase the truth in a world of betrayal and deceit. Let's get started. Miss Marple and the Baby Who Knew the Killer. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow upon the parlor, the sort of gentle light that gave even the most ordinary furnishings a touch of elegance. Miss Marple settled comfortably in a high-backed chair, accepted her cup of tea with quiet gratitude. The hostess, a pleasant woman with hands far too restless for a simple village tea, fussed unnecessarily over the sugar bowl before sitting down. It was, on the surface, a gathering like any other in St. Mary Mead. A polite exchange of village news, inquiries after neighbors' health, and a brief lament about the price of butter. Yet beneath the cheerful chatter lay something else, a thin seam of tension barely concealed beneath the lace cloth. Miss Marple, with her unassuming smile and kindly eyes, was a veteran of such undercurrents. She took no more notice of them than a gardener would of a dark cloud on the horizon, something to be noted, tucked away, and recalled when needed. The house itself had that particular air of forced brightness one finds after bereavement, where every cushion is plumped a little too often, every surface gleams just a little too much. It was not grief that lingered in the air, Miss Marple thought, but the peculiar hush left behind by gossip unfinished. The conversation drifted, as it inevitably would, towards the death. It was not referred to directly at first. These things rarely are. It was merely poor Harold, who had always been rather delicate, hadn't he? And such a shame about the baby, losing his uncle so young. Miss Marple added a soft, "Oh dear, yes," at just the right moment, her hands gently folding in her lap, her expression one of kindly resignation. The art of gathering information, after all, was not about asking direct questions, but about leaving small, inviting silences into which other people's thoughts could comfortably tumble. Harold, Mr. Harold Ridley, had died in this very house just 3 months before. Officially, it had been an unfortunate fall, a misplaced foot on the staircase in the dark, a tragic accident. But accidents, Miss Marple had often observed, were rarely spoken of quite so guardedly. The scones, though warm and well buttered, were eaten without much attention. Each crumb of gossip was far sweeter than currants, and every glance toward the door or window seemed to expect the sudden arrival of an invisible listener. Something was not quite right here, Miss Marple thought, and in her experience, not quite right was usually the first step toward murder. The baby had been toddling about the room for most of the visit, largely ignored except for the occasional, "Mind the table, dear," and "Don't pull Auntie's knitting." But it was when the baby, with a delighted squeal, pointed at a photograph on the side table that Miss Marple's attention sharpened. The picture showed Harold Ridley standing beside his brother and sister-in-law, the baby perched on his arm. It was a perfectly ordinary family photograph, taken at some summer fete, judging by the bunting in the background. But the baby's reaction was decidedly less ordinary. With a giggle that sent a shiver through the adults present, the child mimicked a strange stabbing motion, hand jabbing forward in an oddly deliberate way. The room fell silent for a beat too long. "Oh, darling," the hostess said too brightly. "Whatever are you doing?" but her voice was edged with something close to fear. "Does he do that often?" Miss Marple asked gently, her fingers cradling her teacup. The hostess laughed, though the sound rang false. "Babies are such funny little things," she said. "They pick up all sorts of odd gestures, don't they?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression as mild as skimmed milk. But inside, her mind was already whirring. Babies, after all, do not invent crime scenes from thin air. As the conversation stumbled forward, the baby was scooped up and distracted with a soft toy. Yet Miss Marple had already seen what she needed to see, and more importantly, what the others had hoped she wouldn't. The photograph was swiftly turned face down, but not before Miss Marple noticed something curious in the background. A familiar figure partially obscured by bunting, standing at an awkward angle. It was the sort of thing no one else would have noticed, unless, like Miss Marple, one had spent a lifetime observing what people wish to hide. Then came the mention of the quarrel. It was spoken in passing, but Miss Marple caught it like a fishhook. Something about Harold and a disagreement at the fete. The hostess brushed past the subject too quickly, far too eager to change it, as though afraid the conversation might dredge up something best left buried. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely sipped her tea, her face a picture of gentle innocence. But inside her mind the pieces were already rearranging themselves. An unexpected death, a baby with a memory too young to understand, and a village that knew far more than it cared to admit. Murder, after all, was rarely committed in rage. More often than not, Miss Marple had found, it was a matter of convenience. And what could be more inconvenient than a baby who remembers too much? It was over the second cup of tea that Miss Marple asked the question, so gently, so casually, that it might almost have been overlooked. "Do remind me, my dear, that dreadful night. Was it here, in this very room, or was Harold taken ill upstairs?" The hostess paused just a fraction too long. Her smile held firm, but her fingers twitched at the lace edge of her napkin. "Upstairs, of course, though he had come down earlier, for a little supper. He always liked a bit of cold beef, you know." There was a ripple of agreement from the others, each eager to contribute some harmless memory. Yet Miss Marple's attention was not on the words, but on the spaces between them. The sudden sharp glances exchanged across the table, the way one of the nieces stirred her tea with unnecessary force, the way someone else reached for a cigarette with hands that were not quite steady. Grief, Miss Marple knew, could take many forms, but guilt was rarely so uniform. As the conversation meandered forward, Miss Marple quietly began her familiar mental exercise, the sorting of faces, names, and possible motives, a habit as natural to her as knitting. There was the widowed sister-in-law, whose voice, though perfectly gracious, held a brittle edge whenever Harold's name was mentioned. There was the family doctor, too quick to dismiss questions about Harold's health, his answers delivered with the polished certainty of a man who dislikes being doubted. Then there was the neighbor, a man who had known the Ridleys for years, but who now spoke with the careful detachment of one eager not to recall too much. Add to them the household staff, loyal of course, but loyalty, Miss Marple had observed, could sometimes sour into resentment. And finally, there was the baby's nursemaid, whose fondness for the child was obvious, but whose discomfort in the room was equally clear. Each one, Miss Marple noted, had proximity to the house on the night of the death. And in such a house, where every footstep could be heard, every conversation half overheard, there were more than enough secrets to go around. The baby, quite unaware of the silent weight pressing down on the grown-ups, was playing contentedly with a wooden horse. Back and forth it clattered across the hearth, each pass punctuated by a single word, a word so unexpected that the conversation faltered, the air itself seeming to pause. Hush. It was the way the child said it. A soft, crooning hush, tender but trembling, like the echo of a voice trying to calm both itself and another. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched in her lap. Her gaze rested lightly on the baby, but her mind reached backwards, to that night, to the soundless corridors and the dim light spilling beneath the door. Hush, the baby repeated with the peculiar intensity of the very young, who grasp one word and hold it close. It was not the word itself, but the way it was spoken. Not a mother's soothing lullaby, but the hush of a hand pressed urgently over a mouth. Around the room, no one spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked with exaggerated clarity. And somewhere, in the charged silence, Miss Marple felt the first true tremor of murder. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took the opportunity for a quiet word with the nursemaid. It was framed as no more than idle curiosity, an elderly lady's fondness for village chatter. But Miss Marple's questions, however gently posed, were surgical in their precision. Who had been in the house that night? When exactly had the doctor been called? And, most delicately, where had each person truly been in the hours leading up to Harold's fall? The answers, though delivered with practiced politeness, were full of holes. Alibis that only just held together, accounts that shifted slightly under pressure, and one particular detail that struck Miss Marple as curious. Her door, usually left ajar, had been firmly closed that night. It was the kind of detail no one would think to lie about, unless, of course, the truth of it mattered a great deal. By the time Miss Marple returned to her own little cottage, the evening sky had softened to a pearly grey. The puzzle was far from solved, but already one name had settled, lightly but persistently, at the edge of her thoughts. She would not say it aloud. Not yet. A lifetime of observation had taught her that certainty was a dangerous luxury. Better, for now, to knit and to listen, and to wait for the next innocent remark to confirm what her instincts already knew. For if there was one thing Miss Marple understood, it was this. In quiet villages and in ordinary families, it was never the loud quarrels that ended in murder. It was the hushed ones, the whispers behind closed doors, the resentments left to fester beneath polite smiles. And somewhere between the baby's voice and the closed door, Miss Marple had heard the faintest echo of a killer's hush. It was remarkable, Miss Marple often thought, how much could be learned over something as innocent as tea. Provided one asked the right question in precisely the wrong way, too absent-minded, too seemingly irrelevant. It was astonishing how many tiny confessions would come tumbling out. "Oh, Harold was always difficult," said the widowed sister-in-law, her spoon clinking against the saucer. "You know what older brothers can be, forever telling everyone else how to live." "Not that he didn't have his own troubles," added the doctor, with the sort of knowing glance that suggested those troubles had been much discussed behind closed doors. Miss Marple only smiled, gently prompting without ever demanding. It was a particular talent of hers, that ability to draw out the uncomfortable truth beneath a veil of polite conversation. By the time the second pot of tea was poured, the shape of Harold Ridley's life had begun to emerge. Not the tidy portrait of a respectable man cut off too soon, but something far messier. Old arguments resurfaced, some over money, others over personal slights. A broken engagement was mentioned in hushed tones, though no one would quite say whose engagement it had been. And though each speaker tried, with varying degrees of success, to steer the conversation back to safer ground, Miss Marple noted what they did not say, and whom they avoided mentioning altogether. Beneath the well-pressed linen and polished silver, Miss Marple detected the unmistakable scent of old money quarrels. There had been a dispute about Harold's investments, something to do with a parcel of land, and a sum of money that had somehow vanished between solicitors. It was all very delicately phrased, of course, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime decoding the genteel language of scandal. What truly stood out, however, was the matter of the broken engagement. There had been a young woman, once quite devoted to Harold, who had ended the understanding rather abruptly. No one said why, but the mention of her name caused one of the nieces to drop her teaspoon with a sharp clatter. Miss Marple offered no remark, but quietly stored away the detail. Nothing, she knew, turned affection into malice faster than a love affair gone sour. Except, perhaps, a financial betrayal hidden beneath a family's respectable surface. By the end of tea, the story behind the lace curtains was taking shape. Not the tale of a tragic accident, but a picture formed from resentments, betrayals, and a past that would not stay buried. It was after the guests had gone, and the silver had been cleared, that Miss Marple found herself alone with the baby's nanny, a nervous little woman who wrung her hands even when they were empty. Miss Marple asked, as though it were a passing curiosity, whether the baby had slept soundly the night of Harold's death. "Ah, oh no, miss," the nanny said at once, her eyes darting to the door before lowering her voice. "I never said, because it didn't seem my place. But the poor lamb woke up crying something dreadful." Miss Marple's knitting stilled in her lap. "And did you happen to see anyone?" The nanny hesitated, torn between fear and the relief of unburdening herself. "Well, I didn't see who, not properly. But someone was there, miss. Someone in the corridor just outside the nursery door." "Speaking to the baby?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost too gentle. The nanny nodded, her hands twisted in the corner of her apron. "Soft-like. Just a few words, something to hush him." "And after that?" "He settled down, miss. As though, whoever it was, well, as though they knew just how to soothe him." Miss Marple said nothing more, but in her mind, the night was rearranging itself. No longer a straightforward accident, but a night in which a baby had seen far more than anyone realized. The next morning, over a quiet breakfast, the talk turned inevitably to the dismissed servant. "Unreliable," said the housekeeper, with the firm authority of someone who had never once misplaced a key. "And not entirely honest, if you ask me." The others agreed, grateful for a suspect who was safely absent and conveniently disreputable. It was also neat, Miss Marple thought. A little too neat. The servant had left the household only a week after Harold's death, dismissed for taking a bottle of brandy without permission. But he wasn't in the house that night, Miss Marple said mildly. "Well," said the doctor, "perhaps not in the house exactly." The remark drifted into silence. Miss Marple sipped her tea, offering no argument. But the dismissed servant, she knew, was altogether too perfect a suspect. Later, sitting by her parlor window, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to settle like dust after a storm. There had been too much certainty, she decided. Too quick a readiness to pin suspicion on someone safely gone. Too much eagerness to tidy the matter away. But real guilt, in Miss Marple's experience, was never so conveniently placed. It tended to linger, in half-finished sentences, in hands that trembled without cause, in glances that flickered toward closed doors. And so, as she smoothed out her knitting and glanced at her little notebook, she made a quiet note to herself. The dismissed servant was no more guilty than the silver teaspoons. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, lay far closer to home. And though her knitting needles resumed their quiet clicking, her thoughts were already moving ahead, toward the baby, the photograph, and the hush of a voice in the dark. It was a perfectly ordinary afternoon, or so it seemed. The household had settled into a rhythm of quiet distraction, small tasks, polite conversation, the comforting clink of cups against saucers. The air still carried the faint scent of lavender polish, and something sharper beneath, the kind of unspoken tension that lingers after tragedy. Miss Marple, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, allowed her attention to drift toward the baby. Small children fascinated her, not for their sweetness but for their absolute honesty, their inability to mask what they knew. They were, after all, born observers, long before they became talkers. The baby sat contentedly on the floor, surrounded by a jumble of toys, little wooden animals, a ball with a worn patch, and a set of colorful blocks were strewn around his chubby legs. Each toy was greeted with the same earnest interest, each handled with the solemn curiosity only babies possess. The room's adults, too absorbed in their own half-spoken worries, paid him little notice. Only Miss Marple watched, her expression mild but her mind very much awake. For experience had taught her this. In the most innocent moments often lie the most dangerous truths. Among the toys was a small wooden knife, no more than a harmless relic from an old playset. The baby seized it with obvious delight, waving it about with the exaggerated flourish of a tiny actor. At first, no one took notice. It was merely a child at play. But then, with unsettling precision, the baby plunged the wooden blade downward into the carpet, again and again, with an odd, rhythmic certainty. Miss Marple's knitting slipped from her fingers. The gesture was eerily deliberate, not the random mimicry of a child inventing a game, but the exact motion of a hand driving a knife into flesh, the angle, the downward force. It was not imagined, it was remembered. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the hostess gave a brittle laugh, too high and too quick. "Goodness, what a fierce little soldier you are." But Miss Marple said nothing. The baby, after all, had not invented the gesture. He had seen it, and seen it most likely on the night Harold Ridley died. The room had fallen into an uneasy silence, the kind that follows a joke that no one truly found amusing. The baby, oblivious to the shift in mood, repeated the stabbing motion with even greater enthusiasm, giggling softly to himself. It was the giggle, oddly bright against the hush, that broke the spell. The hostess bent down quickly, snatching the toy knife from his hand and replacing it with a soft cloth doll. "Enough of that, darling," she said, her voice forced into cheerfulness. Miss Marple's voice was gentle when she spoke. Who was near the nursery that night? The question seemed to float across the room, light as air and yet impossible to ignore. The hostess, her hand still gripping the doll a fraction too tightly, faltered before answering. "Well, we all were at some point," she said. "It's a small house after all." The answer was technically true, but entirely evasive, the kind of truth that skirts the edges of a lie. Miss Marple asked nothing further. She simply glanced at the baby, who now sat babbling happily to his doll, unaware that he had just resurrected the memory of a murder. As the conversation shifted to safer ground, Miss Marple's thoughts followed their own quiet path. The baby had not invented that gesture, nor could he have witnessed it after the death, for the door to the nursery had been closed, which meant the killer had stood close enough to the baby to be seen. Not a stranger, then. Not some shadowy intruder slipping through the night, but someone trusted, someone whose presence near the baby caused no alarm. A mother, a father, a beloved aunt, or a trusted servant. Someone who, after committing murder, had paused long enough to hush a crying child with soft words and trembling hands. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking, her expression as serene as ever. But inside her mind the net was already tightening. Murder, she knew, is rarely committed in solitude. Even when the act itself is unseen, someone, often the smallest witness of all, remembers. It was a truth universally acknowledged in St. Mary Mead, that nothing remained secret for long. At least, not if the village shop had anything to say about it. Miss Marple, under the pretext of buying some embroidery floss and a small jar of damson jam, lingered just long enough to draw the shopkeeper into conversation. Mrs. Patrick, whose memory for scandal was as precise as her weighing scales, needed only the gentlest nudge. Terrible business about poor Mr. Ridley. Miss Marple murmured almost absently. Mrs. Patrick's expression sharpened instantly. Well now, I wouldn't like to speak ill of the dead, but... It was always "but" that interested Miss Marple the most. Before long the story began to unfold. Years ago there had been a woman, not from the village, but one who had arrived suddenly, stayed long enough to turn heads and left in rather a hurry. She had been seen walking with Harold Ridley along the lane one evening, too close for mere acquaintances, and there had been talk that died down as quickly as it began, smothered under the polite veil of English discretion. But now, with Harold gone and whispers resurfacing, the past no longer wished to stay buried. By the time Miss Marple had paid for her floss and jam, Mrs. Patrick's voice had dropped to a conspiratorial hush. Pretty thing she was, not quite respectable, if you understand me. Married, but not to him. Not that anyone would say such a thing aloud, of course. Miss Marple understood perfectly. It was the sort of village scandal that never quite disappears, only sinking beneath the surface like a smooth stone in a pond, waiting for the slightest disturbance to send ripples outwards. The woman, a Mrs. Faulkner, had left the village abruptly, and Harold Ridley's engagement had ended soon after. No one had ever confirmed a connection, but the timing had been too neat, and the village had drawn its own conclusions. Now, with Harold's sudden death, those conclusions were being re-examined, polished like old silver brought out for company. The baby's strange behavior, the hush surrounding that final night, all of it felt connected. As Miss Marple stepped back into the street, she allowed herself a faint smile. Villages, after all, rarely invented new sins. They simply repeated the old ones, dressed up in new faces. That afternoon, under the pretext of offering to help sort through Harold's desk, Miss Marple found herself in the study, her room too neat to have been genuinely lived in. Grief, Miss Marple knew, often left rooms untouched, as though waiting for the dead to return and sit down once more. She opened the second drawer, fingers brushing aside papers that had been too carefully rearranged, until she found it. A single scrap of paper, folded small, tucked beneath a pile of old bills. The paper bore only a name, Mrs. Faulkner, no address, no context. But someone had placed it there deliberately, kept it where Harold would see it every time he opened the drawer. It was not sentiment. It was a reminder, the sort people keep when they want to ensure they never forget a debt owed or a secret held. Miss Marple traced the edge of the paper thoughtfully. Blackmail, perhaps. Not over money, but over something far more dangerous in villages like this. Reputation. Secrets, after all, were currency, and Harold Ridley had held this one tightly until the very end. Later over tea, Miss Marple gently asked about Harold's brother-in-law, a man mentioned once and then quickly dismissed, as though the family had agreed to forget him altogether. He left years ago, the hostess said, her voice dismissive. Not much of a loss, truth be told. But Miss Marple was not so easily deterred. After a few quiet inquiries to the vicar's wife, who maintained an unofficial archive of family embarrassments, the story emerged. There had been a quarrel, over money or property. No one could quite remember. The brother-in-law had stormed off, never to return. He had, it seemed, an alibi so perfect it was almost insulting. He'd been seen in London, at a well-attended charity dinner, the very night Harold died. Convenient, yes, but too convenient to be the answer. Miss Marple knew a red herring when she saw one. And this one had been carefully planted, almost as if someone wished the wrong person to be remembered. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, the scrap of paper folded neatly beside her, her mind quietly knitting the facts together. A scandal long buried, a broken engagement no one wished to discuss, a name hidden in a drawer, and a baby who had seen too much. None of these things stood alone. They were threads in a single web, each line connecting to another, until the pattern emerged. A pattern of fear, betrayal, and quiet revenge. Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, the needles clicking softly, like the tick of a clock, counting down the hours until truth could no longer be avoided. Murder, after all, was rarely about hatred. More often it was about the past refusing to stay where it belonged. The afternoon was peaceful in the way only village afternoons can be. Soft, unhurried, with the faint sound of distant birdsong drifting in from an open window. The baby, left to his own devices for a few blissful minutes, sat happily in the center of the room, chattering to his toys in the peculiar language of the very young. Miss Marple, her knitting in hand, but her attention elsewhere, observed him with quiet interest. She had long believed that babies were the truest witnesses of all, for they saw everything and understood nothing. And so they remembered honestly, without interpretation or defense. It was midway through this gentle babbling that something shifted. The baby's nonsense words settled into a pattern, a phrase repeated with peculiar rhythm, over and over again. The sound of it nudged at Miss Marple's memory. Not quite clear enough to place, but troublingly familiar. The baby's tone, too, had changed. A curious blend of imitation and memory, as if recreating something half-heard and half-understood. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind already reaching back to the fragments of gossip, the hurried silences, the closed nursery door. Whatever the baby was saying, it was not random. It was a piece of the past, floating back up like a ghost, small and clear and terribly important. "Hush now, hush. It's all right. Hush." The words, spoken in the baby's high, uncertain voice, were eerily distinct. Too distinct, Miss Marple thought, for a child of that age to invent. Babies absorbed what they heard, the murmured lullabies of the nursery, the gentle scoldings over spilt milk. But this was different. This had a weight to it, a sense of urgency no lullaby would carry. And then Miss Marple remembered. That was the very phrase the nanny had mentioned, the one the baby had cried out on the night of the death. It was the voice in the corridor, the unseen presence who had stood just outside the nursery door in the dark. The room seemed suddenly colder, though the fire burned bright in the grate. The baby, blissfully unaware of the significance of his own words, repeated the phrase again. Exactly the same intonation, the same trembling hush. Miss Marple felt the first prickling certainty settle in her mind. This was no chance echo. The baby had been there, awake and watching, at the very moment when Harold Ridley's murderer had whispered those words to him. Miss Marple had always believed that murder reveals character. There were those who fled in panic, leaving chaos in their wake, and those who tidied up after themselves with chilling precision. But the most dangerous of all were the ones who paused to comfort. Someone, after striking the fatal blow, had stood in the corridor outside the nursery. They had heard the baby stir, a tiny witness to a terrible moment, and they had done what came naturally to them. They had soothed the child, murmured words of comfort, not out of kindness but out of habit. It was that habit, Miss Marple knew, that mattered most. Only someone who had regular intimate contact with the baby would think to hush him. A stranger would have fled. A trusted face, however, would instinctively comfort. This, more than any other clue, was the turning point. The killer was not some distant enemy or sudden visitor. It was someone trusted, someone who had stood at that nursery door countless times before, someone whose voice the baby knew well enough to repeat without fear. And in that gentle, familiar act of comfort lay the single greatest mistake the killer had made. That evening, as Miss Marple wound her wool into a neat ball, her thoughts unwound into something much less orderly. The baby's voice, that soft, imitated hush, had done something no piece of evidence could do. It had narrowed the field to only those who had regular access to the child. A passing visitor would not have known how to calm him. The housekeeper, though ever present, was not the one who settled the baby at night. No, the voice in the dark belonged to someone closer, someone whose presence by the nursery door would raise no suspicion at all. A parent, a nanny, a favored aunt or uncle, or perhaps a family friend who had blurred the line between guest and household. The list, once long and tangled, was now dangerously short. Miss Marple's fingers moved methodically, the wool winding tighter with each turn. Outside, the village settled into evening calm, unaware that the circle was closing. It was always the way in such cases, she thought. Murder, like scandal, was rarely the work of outsiders. More often than not, it was the hand you had held in friendship, or even love, that struck the fatal blow. And somewhere, beneath this roof, that very hand was still reaching out, steady and familiar, to soothe the innocent child who had seen too much. The tea table was laid out with its usual village elegance. Delicate sandwiches, a cake dusted lightly with sugar, and toast cut into thin triangles. It was a scene of perfect domestic calm, yet beneath the surface, tension hummed like a distant wire. The baby, perched on his nurse's lap, was in a particularly talkative mood. His cheerful babble flowed unremarked until the phrase slipped out, clear, distinct, and utterly damning. "Hush now, hush. It's all right." The effect was immediate. One of the guests, a man whose hands had been steady until that moment, spilled his tea. Another, a woman seated nearest the window, caught her breath so sharply it might have been a gasp. Miss Marple, her own cup poised midway to her lips, watched without watching, her gaze comfortably unfocused. Reactions, she knew, were more revealing than words. And there was something in the silence that followed the baby's innocent echo. A silence far heavier than mere politeness. Someone at that table knew exactly why those words mattered. Miss Marple, in her usual gentle way, allowed the conversation to resume, the clink of spoons on china filling the void left by the baby's troubling words. Yet her attention never strayed far from the shaken suspect, a man who now held his teacup with both hands, though there was no need, and whose laughter at some trivial remark arrived a beat too late. She had seen it before. That brittle performance of normality, the desperate attempt to appear untroubled, only to overdo it at precisely the wrong moment. Miss Marple had no doubt. The baby's words had struck a nerve. Later, when the guests had gone and only crumbs and empty cups remained, Miss Marple sat quietly in her corner, knitting untouched in her lap. The baby had not lied. He had merely repeated. And someone in that room had heard their own words thrown back at them. Words spoken in the dark when they believed only a child too young to understand could hear. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a crack in the surface, and Miss Marple had spent a lifetime prying open such cracks until the truth spilled out. That evening Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the house, her hands trailing lightly along the walls, her fingers attentive to the subtle unevenness that only old houses possess. She had asked no permission. No one ever questioned Miss Marple's movements. She was, after all, just a harmless old lady. But behind a faded tapestry near the end of the hall, her hand found what it had been seeking. A narrow door, its edges disguised by years of careless painting. It opened silently under her touch, revealing a passage barely wide enough for a person to slip through. It was the sort of feature old houses often held, built for convenience long forgotten, for slipping between rooms unnoticed, for overhearing conversations never meant for a wider audience. And this particular passage led directly from the family's private rooms to the nursery door. Miss Marple, standing in the dimness, imagined the night of the murder, the quarrel, the fatal blow, the hurried footsteps retreating into this passage. From here a person could have stood unseen, listening to every whispered argument, every hurried step, every cry. And when the baby woke, when small eyes opened to a figure in the doorway, it would have been a familiar face, her voice known and trusted. Miss Marple had spent years observing human nature, and she knew that habits, the little reflexes formed by love or duty, were the hardest things to hide. And it was a habit that had betrayed the killer. The soft, "Hush now, hush," spoken without thought, was not a phrase invented in a moment of panic. It was a familiar comfort, the sort of thing murmured night after night, to soothe teething pains or bad dreams. It was the tenderness of it that gave the final clue. A murderer, yes, but one with an instinct to soothe rather than flee. Someone who knew precisely how to calm the baby, because they had done so many times before. And that meant the killer was not a stranger, not an intruder in the night, but a part of the baby's world, someone whose voice belonged inside that nursery, not outside it. With the hidden passage and the murmured comfort, Miss Marple's list of suspects shrank to a single narrow circle. Only someone with the right combination of intimate access to the baby and knowledge of the house's secrets could have slipped so silently from murder to nursery without raising alarm. There was no need to rush. The truth, Miss Marple knew, had already revealed itself. All that remained was to let the guilty person catch sight of their own reflection, framed not by accusation, but by their own fear. It was Miss Marple's suggestion, framed as the most natural thing in the world. "I do think," she had said with her usual mildness, "that the baby needs a little cheering up after all this unpleasantness. Wouldn't it be nice if the whole family sat together for a bit? Babies are such sociable creatures." The suggestion was met with polite agreement, though the very idea of sociability seemed faintly absurd after so much unease. Still, chairs were drawn closer, fresh tea poured, and the baby placed carefully in the center of the room, a small smiling sun around which the uneasy planets revolved. Miss Marple, her knitting untouched in her lap, made no formal speech. She merely encouraged the baby, in her soft, grandmotherly way, to sing his little song or say his favorite words. The baby obliged, first with nonsense sounds, then with his usual cheerful babble. And then, as if conjured by some invisible hand, the phrase slipped out again, soft and sing-song, the way babies often repeat words they've been soothed with. "Hush now, hush. It's all right." Miss Marple said nothing. She only watched the watchers and waited. The phrase landed in the room like a pebble dropped into still water. There was a moment, barely more than a heartbeat, where nothing happened at all. Then quite suddenly, someone's cup rattled sharply against its saucer, her hand trembling so violently that tea slopped over the edge and stained the linen cloth. It was not the baby's mother, nor the housekeeper, nor even the nursemaid. It was one of the trusted family members whose expression, usually composed to the point of smugness, had gone chalk white, eyes darting as if seeking escape. Miss Marple's face remained serenely blank, her hands folded as if entirely content with the state of the world. But inside, the pieces clicked into place, the habitual phrase, the instinct to comfort, the proximity to the nursery on the fatal night. The baby had not remembered a stranger's voice, but a voice that belonged to his own household, a voice that had lulled him to sleep before the murder, and then once again, just after it. Miss Marple made no accusation. She only noted the panic, the sweat gathering along the hairline, the restless fingers twisting a handkerchief into knots. The guilty, after all, are not caught by proof alone, but by their own frightened silence. Before Miss Marple could speak, someone else did. A young woman, nervous, pale, and already half broken by the strain of suspicion, stood abruptly, her voice thin and shaking. "It was my fault," she said. "I should have told you. There was a quarrel that night. Awful words were said, and I thought I heard something after. But I was too afraid to tell." Tears welled in her eyes, her guilt tangible enough to touch. It was not guilt for murder, Miss Marple realized, but the guilt of silence, the knowledge that she had heard and seen enough to suspect the truth, yet had done nothing. Miss Marple, with her usual kindness, patted the girl's trembling hand. "My dear," she said softly, "you have done nothing wrong." The girl's breath caught in her throat, relief breaking over her like a sudden storm. The others exhaled too. Her family is so desperate for an easy culprit that they were willing to accept the wrong one. But Miss Marple's mind had never wavered. The true killer sat silent still, too experienced to confess, too clever to stumble, but caught nonetheless. The girl's panic was genuine, but genuine fear does not match the sharpened terror of a guilty conscience. When the tea was cleared and the family dispersed, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her needles clicking softly, her face as mild and pleasant as ever. But inside her mind, the net had already closed. The killer's reaction to the baby's phrase had been immediate and uncontrollable. Not merely shock, but recognition, the unmistakable jolt of hearing one's own crime repeated back in innocent lips. And the habit, the soothing murmur, the familiar comfort, that was the final piece. No outsider would have known how to calm that baby. Only someone who had lived within these walls, someone who had stood over that crib night after night, someone whose voice belonged to the baby's world. There was only one person who fit that description perfectly. Miss Marple did not gloat, nor did she indulge in satisfaction. Murder, after all, was rarely the work of monsters. It was the work of ordinary people caught in circumstances they could neither control nor escape. The trap had been sprung, and now there was only one step left: to gently guide the guilty into confessing, not by force, but by the simple weight of their own conscience. For Miss Marple had always believed that, in the end, it is not the detective who solves the case. It is the murderer who solves it for them, by being exactly who they are. It was not presented as an accusation. That was never Miss Marple's way. It was merely a suggestion, polite and practical, that the family might benefit from a proper conversation, now that so much had come to light. The drawing room was chosen. A room large enough to contain the whole household, but small enough that no one could retreat too far into the shadows. The baby, unaware of the drama unfolding around him, was present too, his presence both innocent and essential. Miss Marple settled herself comfortably, her knitting in hand, her expression gentle but unyielding. There was no announcement, no dramatic proclamation, just a series of observations, softly spoken, each drawing the invisible circle tighter. The family, restless beneath the surface calm, could feel the net closing. No one said so, but the air itself seemed charged with unspoken fear, the particular fear that arises when the truth can no longer be postponed. Miss Marple, hands busy with her needles, let the silence do most of the work. She had learned long ago that when the guilty and the innocent sit side by side, it is silence that speaks loudest. It was, Miss Marple explained gently, a very old story, not a unique one. Families have always had secrets, and villages have always found ways to whisper about them. Years ago, there had been a woman, and a scandal, the kind no one ever speaks of directly, but which lingers in glances and silences long after the names are forgotten. Harold Ridley had not been a kind man, nor a generous one, but he had held a secret in his hand like a coin, turning it over and over until its edges wore thin. It was not just money at stake or even reputation. It was the family itself held together by fragile agreements and polite silences. One word from Harold, and the carefully preserved facade would have crumbled, leaving ruin in its place. Murder, Miss Marple knew, was rarely committed out of passion alone. More often it was a matter of practicality, the silencing of one voice to protect many others. In this case, the voice of a man who knew too much, and who had decided it was time to speak. And so, someone had made sure he would never speak again. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, a schoolmistress explaining a simple sum as she turned to the baby. "He saw, you know," she said softly. "He didn't understand, of course, but he remembered." The family stirred uneasily, but Miss Marple continued. "Babies," she explained, "do not invent such things. Not the angle of a hand, not the pattern of a gesture, and certainly not the very words whispered to them in the dark. It was the baby's memory, that innocent, unaltered recollection, that had first troubled Miss Marple. A baby cannot lie, because a baby has no sense of what truth is worth hiding. And so, without malice or intent, the child had carried the truth in plain sight, repeating the killer's words like a nursery rhyme. It was the baby, Miss Marple said, who solved the murder. All I did was listen to him properly." And in that gentle remark, the family saw what Miss Marple had seen all along, that the crime had never been truly hidden, merely overlooked, wrapped in the belief that the very young forget. Even now Miss Marple did not point a finger. She simply laid out the facts, one by one, in her gentle, relentless way, until there was only one possible conclusion. The baby could only have remembered a voice he knew well, a voice that soothed him nightly, a voice that belonged inside the nursery. Not a stranger's voice, but a trusted one. And it was not only the baby who remembered. Miss Marple had remembered too. The shaken hand at tea, the restless fingers twisting a handkerchief, the sudden pallor when the baby had repeated those fatal words. There was no need for confrontation, no raised voice or dramatic accusation. Miss Marple simply let the silence speak, and in that silence, the killer's guilt spoke for itself. It was not hatred that had driven the act, Miss Marple suspected, but fear. The fear of losing everything to a single man's recklessness. And in that moment, fear had proved stronger than conscience. But conscience, Miss Marple knew, never truly disappears. It waits, it watches. And in the end it speaks, in trembling hands, restless glances, and silences too full to be ignored. The confession, when it came, was barely a whisper. No pleas for forgiveness, no elaborate explanation, only a few plain words, spoken by a voice stripped of all its former certainty. "Yes," they said, "it was me." Miss Marple, her expression unchanged, nodded slightly, as though acknowledging something inevitable. She offered no sermon, no condemnation. Murder, after all, was rarely committed by monsters. More often it was the work of ordinary hands, pushed by fear or desperation, or a past that refused to stay buried. The baby, blissfully unaware, played with his toys at the killer's feet, innocence and guilt occupying the same quiet space. Miss Marple folded her knitting, rising with the unhurried grace of someone who had seen too many endings like this before. The truth at last had been spoken, and now it would no longer belong to her. It would belong to the law. But even as the family dissolved into grief and whispers, Miss Marple knew that it was not punishment that mattered most. It was understanding that once fear had entered the house, it had never truly left. In the quiet days that followed, the house settled into a strange kind of stillness, the silence that comes when something long hidden has finally been dragged into the light. There were no raised voices, no dramatic outbursts, just a soft, stunned silence, as if the house itself had exhaled. The police came, of course, statements were taken, facts confirmed. The arrest was gently done, with none of the ugliness the papers so enjoyed describing. After all, this was a family matter, and in English villages, even crimes of passion are handled with a certain politeness. Miss Marple, for her part, made no display of triumph. There was no satisfaction in it. Not really. She had never liked the solving of crimes involving families. The answers were rarely neat, and the guilty were never quite strangers. They were husbands, wives, sisters, friends, people who were, until the very moment they crossed that fatal line, had been ordinary. The case was solved. The facts were in place. And yet, as Miss Marple sat quietly by her window, she knew that the solving of a crime is not the same as the ending of it. Some wounds do not close simply because the truth has been spoken. The baby, too young to grasp the weight of what had unfolded around him, played happily on the floor. His small hands reached for blocks, his cheerful babble filling the room. Oblivious, untouched by the darkness that had passed so close to his cradle. Miss Marple watched him, her expression softening. There was something profoundly comforting about the resilience of children, the way they carried on regardless of the storms adults brewed around them. And yet, she could not help thinking how fragile that innocence truly was. The baby had seen a shape in the dark, had heard words meant to soothe, not knowing that they came from a hand still stained with guilt. In years to come, he would forget, consciously at least. But Miss Marple knew that some memories settle deep in the bones, hidden from view but shaping who we become. The child would grow up surrounded by quieter missions, by a family that would never quite explain what had happened one rainy night when he was far too young to understand. For now, though, he laughed, a clear, perfect sound. And Miss Marple, despite everything, smiled with him. Innocence, she knew, was precious precisely because it could not last. That evening, alone in her own small sitting room, Miss Marple allowed herself the luxury of thought. The case was over. The formalities would be handled by others. But the truth, in all its complicated humanity, belonged to her. She had seen it before. Too many times, if she were honest. Murder in villages was rarely the work of evil masterminds or violent brutes. It was the work of ordinary people, pushed by fear, resentment, or desperation. People who made one fatal decision, convinced they could tidy it away like a spilled cup of tea. But truth always had a way of leaking out, through gossip, through small careless gestures, and in this case, through the unfiltered memory of a child too young to understand silence. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing human nature. She knew how often kindness was mixed with cruelty, how love could turn into fear, and how easily ordinary homes concealed extraordinary darkness. The family would heal after a fashion. They would tidy up their lives, repair their reputations, and learn to speak of other things. But the house itself, Miss Marple thought, would never quite forget. Houses like people carried memories in their bones, and Miss Marple, too, would carry this one. Not for its cleverness, but for the quiet tragedy of it all. Because in the end, the real mystery was not how the murder was done, but how so much sorrow could fit into such a small, respectable life. There was, however, one thing Miss Marple did not share. Not with the police, not with the family. It was a small thing, almost inconsequential, and yet it sat uneasily in her mind. It had to do with the baby's phrase, the innocent words that had led her to the truth. Everyone assumed, quite naturally, that the phrase had come from the killer, spoken in haste after the crime. And that was true. Partly. But there was another voice, too. One the baby had heard before the murder ever took place. A voice that had whispered comfort many nights before, not out of guilt, but out of love. It was the voice of someone who had known the secret all along, who had not killed, but who had known what might happen, and had done nothing to prevent it. Someone who had stood silently in the shadows, unable to choose between loyalty and truth. Miss Marple could have revealed it. She could have handed over that last tangled thread. But she didn't. Some secret, she knew, belonged not to the law, but to the heart. And sometimes the kindest thing a detective can do is to let certain truths remain buried. The case was closed. The facts were known. But somewhere, in the quietest corner of her mind, Miss Marple carried the weight of what was left unsaid, knowing, as she always had, that some mysteries were not meant to be solved. And so, as the rain eased outside her window, Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more. The world, after all, was full of puzzles, and some of them, she knew, were kinda left undone. And so, the curtain falls on yet another mystery. A story not just of crime and detection, but of secrets quietly woven into the very fabric of family life. In the end, it wasn't fingerprints or alibis that unlocked the truth. It was the fragile honesty of a child too young to understand lies. Miss Marple has always known that murder rarely begins with malice alone. More often it starts with fear, the fear of exposure, of old sins crawling back into the light, of reputations built on silence, crumbling with a single word. In this case, it was not just justice being served, but the past demanding to be seen. What lingers most, perhaps, is the image of that innocent baby, oblivious to the weight of what he carried, playing happily while the adults around him crumbled under the truth. It's a quiet reminder that in life, as in mysteries. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.